Hi everybody and welcome to a talk about the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, or at least about its opening few stanzas. Prufrock is the first poem that T.S. Eliot published. It isn't the first one that he wrote, but it's the first one that he published. It's the work of a young man. However, the character of J. Alfred Prufrock is definitely not a young man. And one of the interesting things is to think, how did Eliot get to be inhabiting this middle-aged, disappointed and timid creature? Let's start with the title. It's not a love song. It's a subversion of the idea of a love song. And J. Alfred Prufrock is such a awkward, clumsy, stitched up spoof of a name. It is in fact the name of a business which operated in T.S. Eliot's hometown. And when you take those two syllables apart, you get a kind of, sounds a bit like prude, sounds a bit like frock. So maybe there's something going in there about the suggestiveness of this guy and this complicated prudishness which he has, which is certainly socially paralyzing for him. He is a guy of multiple personalities. He's a storyteller, he's a listener. He's one who reveals himself to the world, but he does it in the form of an inner monologue. It's stream of consciousness. He's joining the dots of his thoughts. They're pretty random at times. They jump from one thing to another. And the structure of the poem reflects this. The term that's used for it is formal instability. While strictly speaking, we would say that this is free verse because it is so varied and so different. We also see that Eliot uses a lot of very conventional poetic techniques. So when you have a look down the side, you'll see lots and lots of end rhyme. You'll see a number of rhyming couplets. You'll see lots of 12-verse stanzas. You'll also see some 2-line refrains inserted in there. And there's a lot of iambic rhythm. Not always pentameter, sometimes hexameter. So the conventions that he's using are the normal, strict conventions of poetry writing, but he puts them together in a way which is new and different. And it's this disruption of the traditional structure and the predictable formality which helps to create the atmosphere of things that are breaking up and not the way they ought to be, and not functioning quite properly, not smooth, not at their best. And that's behind the character of Prufrock himself. He's somebody who is not in great shape. He's got a very worried and troubled mind and some obsessions. At the same time as he has this massive social anxiety, and we see the kind of psychological transitions that he makes as he thinks about this and then connects it up to thinking about that and jumps all over the joint. We see him as awkward, we see him as timid, we see him as physically incredibly inhibited and embarrassed and ashamed about himself. But he also has this wonderful creative insight and a true grasp of artistic things and the way in which the world works. It's a series of discontinuous encounters with people, with events, with things. And the overall narrative arc is that you and I are on our way somewhere. The poem opens, "Let us go then, you and I," with this imperative instruction. But we never really know who he is talking to or who he is talking about. So the literal and symbolic confusion which Prufrock as an individual suffers, it's presented through the language itself. So there's a lot of fragmentation. The meter contains a great deal of interruption. It's open to variation. There's hesitancy, there's abruptness, there are intrusion. It's got a nervous, sort of tense quality to it. The rhythm and the patterns of speech are disjointed. On the vocabulary, however, the words are really normal, everyday words. You never have to look up the meaning of a word in this poem because it's simple, everyday language. The syntax, the imagery, the way the poem is put together, that is not ordinary. But a basic ordinary street vocabulary has been used to create this masterpiece. Okay. Let's begin at the beginning, the epigraph. An epigraph is quote from another work of art, and it encapsulates the meaning or foreshadows the meaning or the message. It's essential for a true interpretation of the poem. Never bypass an epigraph. This one comes from Dante. Dante is a very famous medieval poet, a Renaissance poet from Florence, and he wrote a thing called the Divine Comedy. And in this, he, a poet, descends into hell, guided by another poet, the ancient Roman poet Virgil. And Virgil guides him down into hell, where they meet lots of people who are real life characters who've sinned, either in Dante's own life or they're people and politics and setup, or the characters who are famous from history and from the past. And these people speak to Dante and to Virgil, and they talk about their sins. And the opening epigraph of Prufrock is exactly this. It's a character from the 8th circle of hell in Dante's hell. It's like a laminated series of levels. And the sinners in each different level have committed different sorts of sins, and therefore they get different sorts of punishment. We are in the 8th circle of hell, which is where the fraudsters lie. And these people are trapped in fire. So the man who speaks here to Dante is a sinner whose transgression was to buy absolution from a pope. In those days, you could actually get a kind of discount on going to heaven. If you did something wrong, donated some money to the church, got yourself forgiven by a priest or indeed by the pope, who is the top of the tree, then even though you'd done something wrong, you were still on the right track for landing up in heaven. This character, whose name is Guido de Montefeltro, was a sinner who was guilty of doing this. So he had bought preemptive absolution for his sins from a pope. The particular sin that he got absolution for was that he'd betrayed somebody, but that's not the point. The point is that when he meets Dante, he tells his story. He reveals his shame, his sorrow, his grief, his suffering. He's actually been turned into fire. His tongue is fire. And what he says to Dante is, I can tell you this because we're in hell and no one's ever left hell. No one's ever got out of hell and gone back to earth to tell the story. So it's safe for me to reveal this story to you. And then he goes on and he does so. Well, Dante does return to earth, and so the story does get retold. And so Dante has betrayed Guido in the same way as Guido betrayed the people in his real life. So we've got a sense of these layers here. I think we can safely interpret it that Eliot is Dante, the poet, and the Guido character is Prufrock. Prufrock is telling his story and revealing himself to Eliot, the poet, and Eliot is revealing Prufrock's story to us. By telling Prufrock's story, Eliot betrays Prufrock because Prufrock is his own character creation. Gets very naughty. The important thing for you is to know that this story opens with the idea that the characters are in hell. J.R. for Prufrock is in hell. First stanza, let us go then, you and I, when the evening is spread out against the sky like a patient etherized on a table. World's most startling simile. Absolutely, probably one of the most famous images in the English language. Ether is an anesthetic. It's a patient, something that's sick. It's lying out on the table. It's inert. It's lifeless. It can't move. It's unwell. It's about to be assaulted with a knife in surgery, which, as we know, if what your surgeon does to you, if it were not done with your consent, would be an assault. So the image is a startling one, and it subverts our expectations, because when you say let's go out for an evening walk, what you're expecting is a rosy sunset or something rather lovely. That is not what we get here. And right at the outset, what Eliot's doing is establishing himself as being anti-aesthetic. He does not do beauty. He does unbeauty. Eliot really creates sordid images. His currency is the stuff which is ugly, which is disturbing, which is distressing. Very often it is based in the city, and so it's the stuff that the city is made of which makes it so repellent. And sure enough, let us go through certain half-deserted streets, the muttering retreats of restless nights in cheap hotels, and sawdust restaurants with oyster shells. Okay, the muttering retreats, restless nights. Well, the obvious suggestion there is that in cheap hotels you can buy a room by the hour. So it's prostitution, it's quick sex, or more benignly, it's just high anxiety, restless nights, cheap hotels. Things are not going well. Sawdust restaurants are likewise a sort of fish and chip shop idea, somewhere where there is sawdust on the floor in order to keep the drips off and keep it clean. And the oyster shells, back in these days, oysters were cheap food. They were not necessarily the luxury item because you can scavenge them. You can just go down to the water's edge and there'll be oysters growing on the rocks. So oysters wrapped in newspaper and washed down with a beer is working man's food. So that's what oyster shells mean there. However, oysters are an aphrodisiac and they're good for making people feel romantic. And the fact that it's the shell and not the oyster itself which is left suggests also that there is the idea that the sexuality has been removed and this is just the leftovers. It's the detritus. Streets that follow like a tedious argument of insidious intent. Streets are supposed to be ways to go somewhere. A street is supposed to lead you to a new place. These streets stop you going somewhere. They have an argument with you. They're barriers. You can't get out of them. They follow like a tedious argument. They go on and on and on of insidious intent. Insidious is a nasty word. Insidious means sneaky. It means it's malevolent. It does not have good intentions. Insidious intent suggests that these streets are taking you someplace where it's not a good idea to go. Sorry about that.